So let me ask you, Bart, in light of what you just said, are you saying that you cannot derive, or you don't think anyone can derive a portrait, a historical portrait of Jesus from the Gospels?
No, I think in fact you can. If you look past if you figure out, if you have discrepancies, if you got two accounts that are contradictory to one another, they both can't be right. And so you have to figure out, is one of them right, or are they both wrong? Scholars, of course, have engaged in this for a long time, recognizing that the Bible itself doesn't portray Jesus accurately, but so historians have to reconstruct what Jesus probably was, and I think certainly that is an endeavor that one can do. One can reconstruct a historical Jesus that is not like the portrait of any of the Gospels and say, well, this portrait that we've reconstructed is more likely to be historically accurate.
Okay, I think that I would see that as a very minimalist understanding of what the historical Jesus scholars do. I don't think that these, and I intentionally referred to people in your backyard that you would know, like Ed Sanders, for example. I remind you what Ed said. He doesn't say, you paraphrased him as saying, we can know something. That isn't what he says. He says the dominant view today seems to be that we can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish. He doesn't say absolute certainty with regard to everything, but pretty well.
Yeah, but
what he set out to accomplish.
You know, okay, how many points did he list that we can know?
Yeah, he starts off with, he lists about 10 or 12.
10 points.
And they're very key points.
But there's not much there. It's 10 points.
Well, his baptism.
Jesus got baptized, okay.
Yeah, principal teaching. And so that's why I say...
but he doesn't think that the Gospels give us a reliable portrayal of Jesus. If the Gospels gave us a reliable portrayal of Jesus, we wouldn't have to engage in scholarship on the Gospels. We could just read the Gospels and say that's what really happened.
Yeah, and I think we might have a semantic issue here because, again, I wonder if our standards of history and how we think history ought to be done, details, completion, and so on, comes into play here. You think of biographies written by great people like Winston Churchill. They're voluminous. What we have are, these Gospels are rather small. You have a selection of activities, certain deeds, acts of power that amaze people, and you have some teachings. The whole of Q, the material, it's probably the biggest source that we have from antiquity of Jesus' teaching is about 270 verses. That isn't much. And so I think in fairness to the Gospels, that's what I'm trying to say is they don't give us a lot. They give us a selection. When we take into account the pedagogical principles, the Crea example that I gave, the rearrangement, the editing, then you end up with these discrepancies. I have students who come to me, probably you too. If I understand you, Professor Ehrman, for this last hour, you've been saying this and that, and they give you like 3 sentences.
Yeah, and they're all wrong.
Yeah, but I'm sure, come on now. You say, yeah, you got it. That's right. That's what I was saying, and yet they haven't quoted you. Now, I'm not saying that there's that much of a discrepancy, but so when we talk about, well, they can't be both right, well, actually they can. Because the teaching has been condensed this way in this stream of tradition. It's been condensed a little differently in this stream. It's been applied here. And so when we say, well, it can't both be right, aren't we not being a little bit atomistic in our contextualization and making demands that are really a little strange?
No, because I'm not talking about Crea. I mean, you know, you've been talking about the Crea, and
but they include deeds too.
Yeah, I know, but people here don't know. But I didn't mention Crea at all. I'm talking about flat out contradictions.
Yeah, and that can come about. And see, when we end up with that, when we say, well, no, wait a minute, was he in this village or was he in that village when he said this? I agree with you. He can't have been in both places.
30 seconds.
And nor do we know, in fact, we don't know. But was he in these villages in Galilee? The answer is yes. Was he doing this kind of teaching?
Right, but if he wasn't in both villages, it's inaccurate.
Yeah, and I would concede that those are the kinds of things that are left dangling where we don't know. But that does not prevent the historian from finding the Gospels as reliable and useful in giving us a portrait. And I use the contrast with Gospel of Thomas and so on, because there's no way we would end up with a reliable or genuine portrait of Thomas, if it was from Thomas.
Okay, so this isn't working well because you were going to be asking me questions and I was going to be, and it just went the other way. So, right, so,
it's okay.
So let's try this again. Okay, now it's apparently my turn. Is it my turn? Okay, all right.
Go ahead.
All right. Right. So am I right that you agree that there are contradictions and discrepancies in the Gospels?
Yes.
And do you agree that if there are contradictions between two accounts, they both cannot be historically accurate?
In a certain qualified sense, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. No, which, by the way,
can we go home now?
This happens in the courtroom setting with eyewitnesses. There's nothing strange.
Oh, no, I don't think there's anything strange about it at all. It's just that, but it means that you can't read the Gospels at face value to give you a historically accurate portrayal of Jesus.
Ah, thank you at last for saying that. Read them at face value. Exactly, in whose face, reading it how. That was the point that I was trying to make, to understand what they are attempting to do. Here's his teaching. I'll say this much. No, I'll say more. No, I'll say little. It's conditioning the teaching as well as the deeds and putting them in a variety of contexts. Actually, if you look, you'll notice that many things Jesus says and many things he does, we don't even know where he is. Often we assume he's still in Galilee, but we don't even know that. And so we don't have as much information there as we wish we had. And that's the point that I'm making. Now, maybe it's mostly semantics in our use of the word reliable.
I think we're actually pretty much agreeing.
Again, I come back, if the Gospels, I think the rhetoric, Bart, that you use sometimes might lead the person who is not a biblical scholar with the impression that the task is hopeless, or, well, who knows what Jesus said.
No, I wrote
I
wrote a whole book showing what Jesus really said and did. And so it's not that I think it's hopeless, but I think the problem is that most people, when you ask, does the New Testament present a historically reliable portrayal of Jesus, what they're thinking is, in other words, if I read the Gospel of Matthew and it says that Jesus did this, this, and this, and he said this, this, and this, can I trust that that's really what he said and did? And the scholar answers no.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think...
Which of the scholars that you named, of all the scholars you named, which one of them would say that the Gospels portray Jesus in a historically in other words, that if you read the Gospel, it's telling you what actually happened? Which of the scholars?
Well, I think all of them that I mentioned.
Oh, Craig, none of them.
No, yes, they would, but they would qualify. I wish they were here so they could defend themselves, but they would qualify it. I mean, see, you're going back, I think you're asking the Gospels to give us videotape. That's why I'm trying to say they don't do that.
No, they don't give us videotape. We agree on that. I think most people expect that they do.
Yeah, that's right.
But they don't. But if the Gospels are full of discrepancies and contradictions and historically false information, people conclude then that they're not historically accurate. You might be able to get historical information out of them, but they are not historically accurate accounts.
Well, if you can't get sufficiently accurate information at a sufficient amount, accurate enough and sufficient amount that you can come up with a plausible and most likely accurate historical account. And that's, by the way, you realize that's saying a lot, anything that's 2,000 years ago. We could be saying this, we could be talking about Alexander the Great and be faced with the same problem. Then I think we are talking about reliable sources. I think it's fair to use that adjective when we're talking about that without saying to be reliable, you have to have sources with no discrepancies, no contradictions of that nature.
Okay, so the Gospel of Peter, outside of the New Testament, has King Herod, it has Pilate, it has Jesus get crucified, it has two robbers, it has an account of his death and his burial, setting the guard. Would you consider that all historically accurate information?
A lot of it, yes.
Okay, so do you think the Gospel of Peter is a historically reliable account of the life of Jesus?
In a certain qualified sense, you could say yes.
Oh,
which is probably why a lot of people read it. But it contains a lot of other things that are at variance with the Gospels that are clearly
I know, but nobody's going to argue
like the talking cross, the angels that are miles high.
Nobody's going to argue that the Gospel of Peter is historically accurate, are they?
Well, they would. It's derivative. It's, I think, a rewrite of the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, it's not historically accurate, but it has historical information in it.
Sure.
That's what the Gospels are.
Well, I think we do have a little bit of a semantic difference on that.
Okay, now you get to ask questions.
Well, I guess I could ask, just sound you out on this. This is not kind of, I'm trying to pin you down question, but is the task that are undertaken by many scholars like John Meyer at Notre Dame and others, is the quest, you might call it, for the historical Jesus one that's worth pursuing?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And the reason you have to pursue it is precisely because the Gospels don't give us historically accurate portrayals. If they did, you wouldn't have a quest. All you would have to do is read Matthew and say, oh yeah, Jesus said this, Jesus said that. It says so right here. Jesus did this, yep, it says right here, that, and he did everything that's said in there. But the fact is you can't do that because everybody involved in the quest, except for fundamentalists and very conservative evangelicals, everybody else recognizes that the Gospels as they come to us are not historically accurate, and therefore you have to use very refined and rigorous historical methodology in order to figure out what in there is a historical nugget in the midst of all the contradictions and discrepancies.
I would just challenge you on one point here, and think about that. Even if we had... we were convinced that Matthew is a videotape recording. The quest of the historical Jesus is still necessary because the context is lost. There are so many details that are not there. There are still very, very many loose ends. And just for example, in Matthew 11, you have the interesting story where messengers come from John the Baptist, who was an associate and mentor and predecessor of Jesus. John has been arrested by Herod Antipas. He's in prison. John evidently is discouraged. He sends messengers to Jesus, and they ask him the question, are you he who is to come? Or should we look for somebody else? Now, most commentators say, that's an authentic passage, because why would anyone make up a story where Jesus is in danger of losing his endorsement from John the Baptist? So Jesus replies and says, well, go back and tell John what you see and hear, that the blind regain their sight, lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them. And the question then is, well, was that a messianic exchange or not? Was it a messianic affirmation or not? There was a time when you and I were in PhD studies in the 70s, it was routine for critical scholars to say, well, no, it's not messianic. Jesus probably didn't have a messianic consciousness. Well, Matthew, it introduces the passage. Luke has it also in Luke 7, but it's Matthew, the evangelist, who introduces it this way. When John was in prison and heard about the works of the Messiah. So Matthew, the evangelist, understands it as having something to do with Messiah. A lot of people thought, as perhaps you might have then too, or I don't know, well, Matthew he's wrong. Jesus isn't messianic in his understanding. He just adds that from a post-Easter perspective. And then along comes a discovery at Qumran in one of the caves, Cave 4. And it turns out he's right. And the scroll has very similar language about what happens when the Messiah comes, whom heaven and earth will obey. The blind will regain their sight, people will be healed, dead will be raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. Turns out Matthew was right. And this is part of it too. And so it might be a videotape, but we still don't quite understand the whole story. So I would contend that the academic work, the historical work is required all the time, because sometimes we really don't know quite what we're looking at. We know we don't quite have the whole story, and as we acquire more information through archaeology, through other literature that's published, sometimes these loose ends are tied together, and sometimes we find out we were flat out right wrong, in a negative judgment that we had entertained at an earlier time.
Thank you for that question. I'm just going to say I completely agree with you, and I would not argue that if Matthew were a videotape, then scholarship would no longer be necessary. I wouldn't argue that.
Okay, good. I forgot who's asking questions now. Am I?
The answer is no one. You are, I think.
Oh, okay.
Let's move on to Bart.
My turn. Okay, good. Right. Okay. So, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says a lot of I am sayings, very famous sayings. Before Abraham was, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, etc. These I am sayings. And at one point, of course, he says, the Father and I are one. So my question to you is, do you think the historical Jesus really said these things?
I think most of these things were not uttered as we find them by the historical Jesus. So I suspect we don't have too much difference on John. My view is the Gospel of John is a horse of another color altogether. It's a different genre. John is often compared to the wisdom literature. It's like wisdom is personified. Chokmah, Lady Wisdom, or in Greek, Sophia. She wanders the streets, she calls out to people, she does things. Well, nobody would read that and think, did you see Wisdom going down the street the other day? Nobody would think that as a literal person. What is mysterious to me about John is that once you say that and say, okay, perhaps we should interpret the I am statements as he is confessions, he is the light of the world, he is the way, truth, and the life. He is the bread of life. A confession of the Johannine community that likely generated that version of the gospel. About the time you think John is a gigantic parable, and then along comes a scholar who says, it's loaded with historical details also. And so that's what makes John so tricky. There is a Society of Biblical Literature section devoted to John and the historical Jesus, chaired by a scholar named Paul Anderson. So that's probably more answer than you want, but I don't disagree with you too much on that point. No. I think John is studded with historical details. Yeah. Maybe you called them nuggets. That's not a bad way of describing John. Okay. But I think the synoptics are more than just some nuggets.
Okay, so let me just add to pursue it then. I mean, John, I think both of us are agreeing that John is not historically accurate. It's theologically been probably the most important of the Gospels, I would say, historically, and people relish the theological. But in terms of its historical accuracy, if you were there, you would not have heard Jesus say these things, probably. It's a later theological reflection.
Not in so many words, not like that. No,
okay.
I don't think so.
So if we toss John out, what about...
We're not tossing John out, but... And by the way, Bart, I object to saying it's not historically accurate. Well, if something that isn't exactly historical, how is it not historically accurate? It'd be like saying, you mean the parable? The parable was a fiction that Jesus told? It's not an actual event? You mean it's not historically accurate?
Right. Well, we would have to argue what John was intending to produce, whether he was
That's exactly what the question is.
And we have no access to his intentions.
And that's and that's true for anything from antiquity, I suppose.
Okay, so
that's why we do exegesis.
All right, so if we agree that John is not historically accurate, which one of the Gospels is? All right. No, you have said that Jesus didn't say, okay, you are not going to use John as a blueprint for writing the historical life of Jesus because you think it's
Fair
metaphorical.
Enough.
So, which gospel then is historically accurate?
I think as far as the synoptic gospels are concerned, I would say all three.
They're all three accurate?
Of course.
But they have discrepancies.
Yes. And accurate sources that cover the ground differently and selectively do. Now, if you were to ask me this, which of the three Gospels is in a strict chronological order, I would say neither one. If you were to say which one consistently quotes Jesus verbatim, I'd say none of them does that. See, so that's why I'm getting back to we must understand historiography, what we're writing, what we mean by history. It's not tape recording, it's not videotaping.
This is why I think it's a sleight of hand.
I don't think it is.
Because if you read an article in the newspaper about an event that happened...
The newspaper today or 2,000 years ago? So you're
right,
using
you're reading the
modern
Jerusalem Times.
example.
No. The question is, are they historically accurate? It's not, were they done according to ancient protocols of historiography? That's not the debate topic. The debate topic is, are they historically accurate? And my point is that if you read an article in the newspaper that records things that didn't happen, that says things that were not said, you would not come away saying that's historically accurate.
I don't know if that is true, though, with respect to the Synoptic Gospels, to say these are things not said or events not done.
You just said that, in fact, they contain things that did not happen.
No, I'm referring to the Synoptics.
Yes.
Yeah.
You think everything in the Synoptics happened, that everything's recorded historically accurately in the Synoptics?
I would answer it the way I think any historian would with regard to any ancient text, and that is, there are things where we are very confident these happened. There are other things where we think they're probable. There are other things we think, well, we're not really sure. Then there might be, at the edges, some things where some would dogmatically say, I don't think these occurred. The trying to prove the negatives, those are the ones that make me uneasy. So for me, most of the synoptic tradition is authentic. The rest of it, there are parts of it, I'm not sure. And I leave it at that.
So time means what? It's his turn to ask questions?
Yeah, he gets to ask you questions.
Okay.
Well, Greg, in my own view, I mean, I don't think I have any particular questions for Bart. Part of it is just, obviously, we've been around and around this mulberry bush before. I'm quite content to go to questions from the audience now, if that's okay with you, Bart.
I do have one more question.
Well, then you go ahead. I'm game.
Okay. My question would be, do you agree with what's I would say probably the majority of scholars since Albert Schweitzer, that Jesus is best understood as some kind of Jewish apocalyptic prophet?
Yes, but I'd have to hear your definition of apocalyptic, because I don't think Schweitzer understood what apocalyptic meant. And I'm not sure the Jesus Seminar has a clue what that means.
No, they don't.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah. Apocalyptic is a Greek word that basically means a revelation or something that's revelatory. It often gets tied in with North American modern ideas about the end of the world, which occurred, I guess, October 21st. So why are we here anyway? Yeah, no, but was Jesus proclaiming from a revelatory point of view, has a vision, understands the rule of God and things changing in his time? I think that was, yes, very much part of his proclamation, yes.
Okay.
We are told by who you are, but desire.